What would you do if your entire life turned out to be a lie? Could you handle the truth if the person you loved had a secret so dark it could destroy your entire world? In this true crime case, we dive into the horrifying story of a woman who uncovered a devastating secret about her husband, a secret that led to one of the most brutal murders in Brooklyn's history. This isn't just a story of betrayal. It's about trust shattered, deception spiraling into madness, and a marriage tainted by the darkest of truths. In the end, the revelation wasn't just life-changing. It was deadly. Before we dive in, comment below where you are watching from, and also tell us about any crime case you have heard or happened to your loved ones. On the surface, Alicia Thomas and James Walker seemed to be the perfect couple. Both were young, attractive Black Americans living in Brooklyn, New York. Alicia, 28, with her smooth caramel skin and piercing brown eyes, radiated confidence. Her natural curls framed her oval face, a mixture of warmth and ambition. She was an accomplished real estate agent known for her sharp mind and even sharper looks. Alicia's beauty was both effortless and striking, turning heads wherever she went. James, at 30, was tall with deep ebony skin and a smile that could charm anyone. His athletic build, a product of years playing basketball in college, paired with his calm and composed demeanor, made him seem like the ideal husband. He worked as a community pastor, deeply involved in his church, and his faith was at the center of his life. James was always impeccably dressed, his suits tailored to perfection, with an aura of quiet authority that drew people to him. His love for his wife appeared genuine, the kind of love that seemed untouchable. Their wedding was the talk of their Brooklyn neighborhood, an elegant ceremony filled with love, promise, and the kind of future most people only dreamed of. The two were inseparable, united not just by love but by shared values, especially their strong Christian beliefs. But as perfect as their relationship appeared, there was one debt that Alicia had been grappling with since the start: the absence of physical intimacy. James was always careful, reminding Alicia of their decision to wait until after marriage. "It's about more than the physical, Alicia. Our bond is spiritual. When we're married, we'll have all the time in the world for that," he would tell her, his dark eyes filled with a soft kindness that always reassured her. So Alicia waited, holding on to the belief that everything would change once they were husband and wife. Their wedding night arrived, and it was everything Alicia had envisioned. The room was dimly lit by candles, their hotel suite filled with the scent of lavender and roses. Alicia stood in front of the mirror, admiring herself in her silk nightgown, her heart racing with nervous anticipation. But James was different that night. Instead of the passion Alicia had longed for, he seemed distant, his touch more like that of a stranger than a new husband. He gently kissed her on the forehead, guiding her to bed. His affection felt empty, almost as if he were going through the motions. As they sipped champagne, James poured her a glass, flashing that familiar reassuring smile. "Just relax, Alicia. We've waited this long. Let's take it slow," he whispered. Exhausted from the day's festivities, Alicia took a sip of the champagne and felt a sudden wave of drowsiness hit her, the world around her fading into darkness. She couldn't remember falling asleep, but when she woke the next morning, her body felt sore, like something had happened though she had no memory of it. "James," she mumbled, still groggy. "Did we, last night? Did we finally?" James was already dressed, standing by the window. He turned to her with that same calm smile. "Yes, Alicia, everything's perfect. We're married now. We're one." But something didn't feel right. The fog in her mind, the gaps in her memory, Alicia brushed them off, trusting James more than her instincts. He was her husband, after all. As the weeks went by, their marriage settled into a routine. But every night it was the same. They would attempt intimacy, and each time James would insist on pouring her a drink. Each time, Alicia would wake up the next morning with no memory of the night before, her body feeling the same dull soreness. Her doubts began to grow. Why couldn't she remember? Why was James so secretive? He never spoke about the details, always dismissing her concerns with a soft kiss and the same reassurances. 6 months passed, and Alicia still wasn't pregnant. This was when the tension began to build. Alicia, who had always dreamed of having children, grew frustrated. She had been waiting for the joy of announcing her pregnancy, but with no signs, she began to panic. "James, why haven't I gotten pregnant yet? It's been 6 months. Are we doing something wrong?" Alicia's voice was tight with anxiety. James, always calm, avoided her gaze. "It takes time, Alicia. God has a plan for us. We have to be patient." But Alicia wasn't buying it anymore. Her body didn't feel like she had ever been with her husband, and the growing suspicion gnawed at her daily. The idea that James was hiding something from her consumed her mind, feeding into her worst fears. Her frustration soon turned to obsession. She needed to know what was happening. Why couldn't she remember their intimate moments? Why wasn't she pregnant? The doubts, once small whispers in her mind, became a deafening roar she couldn't ignore. One evening, after yet another night of vague reassurances and forgotten moments, Alicia decided to take matters into her own hands. She bought a small hidden camera and installed it in their bedroom. The gnawing fear that James was hiding something from her overwhelmed her, and she had to know the truth. The next morning, after another drink and another blacked-out night, Alicia woke up and checked the footage. Her hands shook as she pressed play, her heart pounding in her chest. What she saw in those minutes of footage shattered her world. James wasn't alone in the room. He had drugged her again, but this time, after ensuring she was unconscious, he called someone, a man. She watched in horror as this stranger entered their bedroom and touched her, taking advantage of her unconscious state while James watched. Every moment of intimacy she had thought was shared with her husband had been a sick, twisted lie. The man was James's ex-lover. It was all too much to comprehend. The betrayal, the violation, the lies. It was more than Alicia could bear. Her entire life felt like a nightmare, one she couldn't wake up from. And the worst was yet to come. The footage haunted Alicia. Every time she closed her eyes, it played on a loop. The betrayal, the deceit, the utter violation. Her husband, the man she had loved and trusted, wasn't who he said he was, not even close. She had married a liar, someone who had used her in the worst possible way. Worse still, her husband had never even touched her. The child she had so desperately wanted wasn't even his. It was the result of someone else. A stranger James had led into their home, their marriage bed. The shock consumed her, suffocating her every breath as rage began to take over. Her body trembled as the gravity of the situation set in. Her marriage had been a lie from the start. James had never loved her. The man she had vowed her life to was hiding a secret so dark and twisted that it defied everything she believed in. Alicia's hands clenched the sheets as she replayed the video, needing to see it again to ensure her mind wasn't deceiving her. But no matter how many times she watched, the horrifying truth remained. James was in the room, watching the man, his ex-lover, violate her. The man, a tall figure with a muscular build, was someone she had never met before. He wasn't from their neighborhood, and he certainly wasn't from their church. His rough hands explored her body in a way James never did, while she lay there, motionless, unaware of the horror unfolding. The next few days were a blur. Alicia didn't know what to do. The trust she once had in James had evaporated, replaced by a boiling rage she could barely contain. Every time he looked at her with that same calm smile, she wanted to scream and lash out. But she couldn't. Not yet. She needed to be smart. She couldn't confront him without proof, without a plan. She needed to know more. Why had he done this? Why had he gone to such lengths to deceive her? What was he hiding? That night, after pretending everything was fine, Alicia planted another camera, this time in the living room where James would spend hours on the phone. She needed to hear what he was saying, who he was talking to, and why. The web of lies was deeper than she had ever imagined. As James left for church, his usual routine, Alicia eagerly checked the footage. There it was. Another devastating blow to her heart. James was on the phone, his voice low and intimate, speaking to the same man from the video. "I don't know how long I can keep this up," James whispered, pacing the living room. There was silence on the other end, and then James's voice grew even quieter. "No, she doesn't know, but it's only a matter of time before she figures it out. I can't keep drugging her forever." Alicia's stomach twisted in knots, rising in her throat as she listened. He knew. He knew what he was doing to her. The drugs, the lies, it had all been intentional. And for what? What was James's endgame? "I told you we should have never gotten married," James continued, his voice tinged with regret. "But I couldn't help it. I needed to prove that I could live this life, that I could be the man everyone expected me to be. But I can't. I miss you." Alicia's heart stopped. She leaned in closer to the screen, desperate to catch every word. The man on the other end was speaking now, his voice too low to make out clearly, but the tone was unmistakable. This was more than just a past lover. This was the man James truly loved, the one he had been hiding all along. "I know," James said, his voice breaking. "I know, and I'm sorry, but it's too late now. If I leave her, it'll all fall apart. I'll lose everything, the church, the respect, the reputation. I can't do that." Alicia's hands shook violently as she heard him confess everything she had feared. It wasn't just about the betrayal of their marriage. It was about James's entire life. He wasn't the man he had claimed to be. He wasn't just hiding an affair. He was hiding his entire identity. The realization hit her like a freight train. James was transgender. That was why he had avoided intimacy and resorted to drugging her night after night. The truth was too dark and complex for him to reveal. But instead of being honest, he had chosen to lie to deceive her in the most grotesque way possible. He had taken away her choice, voice, and agency, all to protect his own secret. The rage inside her grew, a slow-burning fire that erupted into a full blaze. Alicia was done being the victim. She was done being used. She needed to confront him, but it wouldn't just be a simple conversation. No, this needed to end in a way that would make him feel every ounce of the pain he had caused her. That night she didn't sleep. Her mind raced with possibilities, each one darker than the last. She wanted to hurt him the way he had hurt her. She wanted him to suffer, to feel the same sense of helplessness and fear that she had felt. But more than that, she wanted him gone. She wanted him erased from her life, from existence. The next morning, as James left for church again, Alicia made her move. She had seen enough true crime shows to know how this worked. She knew exactly what to do. She bought a bottle of wine, the kind James loved, and waited for him to come home. When he walked through the door, his usual calm smile greeted her, but this time Alicia didn't feel the familiar sense of warmth. All she saw was the man who had destroyed her life. "Hey, babe," he said, leaning in to kiss her. "What's all this?" "I figured we could celebrate," Alicia replied, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. "I've been thinking a lot about us. I feel like things have been a little off lately, and I want to make it right." James smiled, taking the glass of wine she offered. "That sounds perfect." They sat together, sipping their drinks, and for a moment everything seemed normal. But Alicia's mind was racing. She had crushed several sleeping pills into his wine, enough to knock him out for hours. She watched him closely as he drank, waiting for the moment his eyelids began to droop and his speech became slurred. "Alicia, he started, but his words trailed off as the drugs took effect. His body sagged in the chair, and within minutes he was out cold. This was it, the moment she had been waiting for. Alicia's heart pounded in her chest as she dragged James's unconscious body into the bedroom. The plan she had concocted over the past few days was playing out perfectly. She grabbed a kitchen knife, its cold steel glinting in the dim light of the room. Standing over him, Alicia's rage boiled over. All the pain, the lies, the deceit, everything came rushing to the surface. "I trusted you," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I loved you." Without another word, she plunged the knife into his chest, the blade sinking deep into his flesh. Blood spurted from the wound, soaking the sheets beneath him. James's body jerked violently, but he was too drugged to fight back. Alicia stabbed him again and again, each thrust fueled by her anger and heartbreak. When she finally stopped, her hands were covered in blood, her breath coming in ragged gasps. James was dead. The man who had deceived her and taken everything from her was gone. But it wasn't enough. The rage still simmered inside her, demanding more. Alicia grabbed a saw from the garage and returned to the bedroom, her mind numb as she began the gruesome task of dismembering his body. The room was filled with the sickening sound of bone and flesh being torn apart, the blood splattering across the walls and floor. By the time she was done, James's body was nothing more than pieces of flesh and bone scattered across the room like a grotesque puzzle. Alicia stood in the center of it all, her chest heaving, her hands trembling. She had done it. She had finally taken control. But as she stood there, covered in blood, the reality of what she had done began to sink in. There was no going back now. She had crossed a line, one that could never be undone. The scent of bleach and blood mixed in the air, clinging to Alicia's skin as she stood over the butchered remains of her husband. The weight of her actions pressed down on her, heavy and unforgiving. The walls of the bedroom, once a sanctuary for her marriage, were now a monument to horror. Blood pooled in places that were once filled with love and trust, but now there was only carnage. James was gone, and with him every lie he had ever told, every deceit, and every manipulation had ended in a brutal act of vengeance that Alicia could barely comprehend. Even as her hands trembled, bearing the evidence of her unspeakable crime, her mind didn't slow down. She needed to clean, to erase, and to escape. But there was another layer of truth that began to settle over her. She was pregnant. The day after the murder, Alicia's body was still reeling from the revelation. The morning sickness, the fatigue, the emotional instability, all signs she had attributed to the stress of her failing marriage, were now undeniable symptoms of pregnancy. Her stomach turned at the thought. She wasn't just carrying a child. She was carrying the child of a man she had never met, a man her husband had drugged and let violate her body in the most repulsive way. She hadn't just killed James out of revenge. She had killed him because her entire identity had been stolen by his lies. Still, the shock of it all wasn't enough to push Alicia into oblivion. Her instincts were too strong, too sharp. As the hours after the murder ticked by, she knew she had to act fast. James's dismembered body was still in the house. She couldn't leave it there. The blood would seep into the carpet, the smell would attract attention, and soon the neighbors would start asking questions. Alicia's hands were raw from scrubbing, her arms sore from dragging the remains of her husband across the room. She packed the pieces into thick black trash bags, sealing each one with a grotesque sense of finality. The dismembered remains of the man who had once been her husband were no longer recognizable as human. They were just pieces now, like discarded trash. The cleanup took days, and Alicia's paranoia grew with each passing hour. She kept the blinds closed, the lights dim, and her phone off. She wasn't ready to face the outside world. Not yet, Not when she had no idea how to dispose of the body. There were stories she'd heard, grim rumors about people dumping bodies in secluded woods or setting them ablaze in deserted parking lots, but none of those options seemed feasible. Not in Brooklyn. Every noise outside the apartment sounded like a police siren to her. Every car passing by felt like it was slowing down to peer into her windows, as if the world could sense the evil she had committed inside. But it wasn't just fear of being caught that haunted her. It was the pregnancy. Alicia could feel the life growing inside of her, a life born out of deceit, violence, and betrayal. The irony of it was too much to bear. After months of questioning why she hadn't gotten pregnant with James, now she carried a child that wasn't even his, from a night she had no memory of. The disgust she felt for her body was palpable, her mind unraveling with each passing day. But she couldn't let it stop her. She had to finish what she started. One night, under the cover of darkness, Alicia packed the black bags into her car, her hands shaking as she glanced over her shoulder. She drove aimlessly, unsure of where to go or how to get rid of the evidence. Panic set in. What if she was stopped by the police? What if someone saw her? The fear gnawed at her until she found herself in an industrial district where the streets were empty and the buildings long abandoned. It was there that she began to discard the bags, one by one, into a series of dumpsters. The sound of each bag hitting the metal echoed in the empty streets, the weight of her actions sinking deeper with each thud. When the last bag was gone, Alicia stood in the silence, staring into the abyss of the dumpster as if it could swallow her whole. There was no turning back now. The deed was done, and James was gone. But the pregnancy was not. Months passed, and Alicia's belly grew, a constant reminder of the crime she had committed and the lies that had led her there. She no longer cried or trembled when she thought of James. Instead, a cold detachment took over, numbing her to the reality of her situation. She moved out of their apartment, renting a small one-bedroom in a different part of the city. Her plan was simple. She would raise the child, live a quiet life, in hopes that no one ever uncovered the truth. But secrets, especially ones as dark as hers, have a way of clawing their way to the surface. By the time Alicia was 8 months pregnant, she had convinced herself that she could escape the past. The child growing inside her would be hers and hers alone. She wouldn't think about the father or the circumstances of its conception. She would move forward and maybe, just maybe, find peace. But that hope was shattered when the police knocked on her door. The investigation into James's disappearance had been slow at first. After all, people went missing in New York City every day, and a man with a troubled past like James wasn't exactly a priority. But when a city worker stumbled upon one of the black bags in the industrial district, containing a human hand, the case exploded into the public eye. DNA tests quickly identified the remains as James, and from there, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Witnesses had seen Alicia's car in the area, and security cameras had captured her driving away from the scene. It wasn't long before the police tracked her down. Alicia was arrested in her small, run-down apartment, handcuffed and led away as the neighbors watched in horror. She didn't resist. She didn't cry. She had known this day would come, and now that it had arrived, she felt nothing. The trial was brutal. The media descended on the case, labeling it one of the most horrific and twisted murders the city had ever seen. Alicia's story became national news. The woman who had killed her husband after discovering his secret, the woman who had dismembered his body and tried to erase his existence. The defense tried to paint her as a victim, a woman who had been driven to madness by her husband's lies and deceit, but the prosecution was relentless, focusing on the cold, calculated nature of the crime. They showed the jury the video footage of James drugging Alicia, of his betrayal with the other man, but they also showed the gruesome photos of his dismembered body, piece by piece. In the end, it wasn't enough to save her. Alicia was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The child, born just weeks after her arrest, was placed into foster care, a tragic reminder of the life that had been conceived through deceit and betrayal. The man who had impregnated Alicia was revealed in the footage of James drugging her and allowing another man into their bedroom. He faced legal consequences as well during the trial. Once the video was presented, it became clear that this man had been an unwitting participant in James's sick plot. He had no idea that Alicia had been drugged, and as far as he knew, his encounter with her was consensual. However, despite his claims of ignorance, the police launched an investigation into the man's role in the incident. His identity was uncovered as James's ex-boyfriend, a man with a complicated past with James. While he hadn't directly orchestrated the events, the authorities saw him as complicit in the crime. The prosecution argued that whether he knew Alicia was drugged or not, he had played a part in the monstrous violation of her trust. The man was charged with sexual assault due to the nature of the encounter, though his defense argued that he had been deceived as well. The court found him guilty of lesser charges related to the assault, though not on the same level as James, who had masterminded the entire ordeal. His sentence was significant, but not as severe as Alicia's. He received a sentence of 15 years in prison for his involvement, with a possibility of parole after serving a portion of his time. In the eyes of the court, his ignorance of the true situation did not absolve him of responsibility, and justice demanded he pay for his part in Alicia's tragic spiral into violence. While Alicia would spend her life in prison, knowing that the father of her child was also behind bars did little to ease her pain. Both the man and Alicia had become victims of James's twisted manipulations, their lives destroyed by the one secret that had pushed them all past the point of no return. The child, innocent and unaware, would grow up in a world where the sins of the father and his accomplice cast a long, dark shadow.